we experience the world not just of the story itself, of the art itself, where things are hazy and confusing and we're not certain about anything, but we experience an understanding of what the world outside the art is, the world that produced the art, the culture that produced the art, where uncertainties are everywhere, where there is no such thing of certainty at all. We spoke a little bit last week about the challenge of Nietzsche. Nietzsche says God is dead, and the implication is, so what are you going to do about that? It is left up to us to recreate any notion of logic in the universe. And these stories capture that. They highlight the fractures in objective reality that maybe we take for granted or maybe we don't even recognize. But a cornerstone way of looking at this work from this era is through the characteristics of the subheadings of movements within the modernist era. And I dropped one word, postmodernism, which is a fairly specific and yet maddeningly confusing term, often overlaps with an awful lot of modernism, as these things do. But in it, you often find a single consciousness that you're following throughout that is trying to negotiate the world and navigate the world in a highly fraught, uncertain manner. You get a single consciousness in a highly subjective world. There is no divine order. There is no enlightened structure to society. There is no hierarchy imposed upon us by God, only the hierarchies that we create for ourselves. Without that objective reality, we get dialogue and characters that are often very hazy and vague because we're seeing them only through the perspective of that singular character that we're following throughout the piece. They have no objective reality beyond that. The interiority of that single character is often at odds with the narration itself. We often get what is known as free indirect discourse, which is indirect, meaning we are not experiencing the language directly from the character as if it were doing a monologue, but rather we're getting it reported through an intermediary of a narrator. So it's already like at arm's length. We're already having to think about it a little bit more curiously. If this is the voice of God showing me this, that's one thing, but now it's just another person telling me that this person says that. So can I take that seriously? The problem gets even more complicated when you start getting a third person narrator telling you the thoughts of what is going on inside this very personal individual character. And they're hopping back and forth out of that consciousness. That's kind of a weird, almost godlike power right there. But it forces you to think about those things. So that's a very brief and insufficient shorthand for postmodernism, where they're breaking down or at least highlighting the cracks throughout perception and perspective. Another category that we see an awful lot of in this era is post-colonialism, which is in a world where the colonial order of empires that flourished throughout the, let's say, 19th century, that has broken down. With the liberation of India out from under the British Empire in, 1948 or something like that, after World War II, which led to the partition of India and Pakistan and all of the issues that come from there, there is a profound meditation on the structures of society that work to oppress, that work to create underclasses, to impose power structures, to impose hierarchies. This is a prominent characteristic that we're going to see in a lot of work throughout this era. And of course, also the birth of modern feminism, if you will, the feminist art, working from that same basic premise of post-colonialism, but there the hierarchy is almost exclusively upon gender, about getting us to rethink and re-examine the ideas of what it means to be one gender or the other, or ultimately, as we have been considering in the last couple of years, is the idea of gender itself even fraught and oppressive. All of that stuff is going on, and all of that stuff is developing through this art, and we need to be aware of it. Now, Clarice Lispector's Daydreams of a Drunk Woman is not an easy story to get a hold of. You can make an argument that it's really not even a story at all, because whether or not you find a plot in there, a development in there, a character arc in there, is really a matter of deep personal opinion. You got to cobble together an awfully elaborate interpretation of this work in order to identify something as objective as an organized, structured plot, because organization and structure are not really the products of an organized, or not really the products of the universe as the modernist or late modernist or postmodernist world would have it. And so you have to approach it a little bit more experientially, a little bit more impressionistically. I'm reading this and I'm not able to follow it as if it has a beginning, middle, and an end like Aristotle would like. It doesn't necessarily have a clearly defined development of character or story or anything like that. So I'm left to ask myself, well, what is my reaction to this? What am I thinking as I go along? What is the act of reading this doing to me? And, well, that frees you up to make your own assumptions. It demands, in fact, it drafts you into the responsibility of making your own assumptions, because that's kind of what we all have when we don't have an objective reality formed for us. We have to build it. So in approaching a story like this, you just take it honestly one line at a time. The first line in this story would have to be the title, The Daydreams of a Drunk Woman. And that's quite the title. And immediately there's a certain moralism about that. There's a certain disdaining of it. The daydreams, not a serious thing, of a drunk woman. You can make an argument that, well, being drunk is bad enough, but a woman too. Oh my God, how horrible is that? So the daydreams of a drunk woman, there's an awful lot going on in there that is signaling to you that you should prepare yourself to read this perhaps from a position of some disapproval. Or it is highlighting for you that that might be a tendency. And maybe you shouldn't give in to that like so many other people might. Like so many other people might assume you are that negative, that judgmental. So that's just the title. We're not far into it yet. But then you move on and just take a look at the first paragraph. It seemed to her that the trolley cars were about to cross through the room as they caused her reflected image to tremble. She was combing her hair at her leisure in front of the dressing table with its 3 mirrors, and her strong white arms shivered in the coolness of the evening. Her eyes did not look away as the mirrors trembled, sometimes dark, sometimes luminous. Outside, from a window above, something heavy and hollow fell to the ground. Had her husband and the little ones been at home, the idea would have already have occurred to her that they were to blame. Her eyes did not take themselves off her image. Her comb worked pensively, and her open dressing gown revealed in the mirrors the intersected breasts of several women. You can be forgiven if you're a little confused by that. I don't know what's going on there. Everything is so indistinct. It's like I walked in the middle of a conversation or something, or a monologue, and I'm sorry, was there something before this? Who is this person? Where are they? What is going on? It just seems like rambling in the middle of a kind of delirium. But you start to look for patterns then. You start to pick through, well, okay, what was really being said here? It seemed to her that the trolley cars were about to cross through the room as they caused her reflected image to tremble. Well, okay. It seemed to her that these trolley cars were going to cross through the rooms. Realistically, trolley cars aren't necessarily indoor things, unless you count like an indoor station. But realistically, all right. Especially after the title referencing drunkenness, we can say that, well, if it seemed to her, and I know the her is the woman, and she is drunk, then I can assume that this is a kind of delusion. This is a kind of hallucination. This is a kind of mistaken perception that is going on here. So we're being warned of that right away. Okay, so we got that there. And trolley cars. What could trolley cars? Well, quite frankly, in a post-Freudian world, all trains are phalluses in one way or the other. So, all right, trolley cars. Maybe they are penises. Who knows? But here they are. That it is a plural. There are like two of them. So, all right, two or more. All right. So we have multiple penises, perhaps, about to cross through the room to violate her privacy, to violate her inner sanctum. This is starting to get kind of visceral now. Suddenly we're talking about rape, as they cause her reflected image to tremble. Reflected image, so she is looking at herself in a mirror, and she's looking and she is seeing the image tremble. Does that mean that the mirror is shaking, or is she shaking? Is she feeling violated? Is she scared? Well, geez. Is it the image or the reality? But of course, if we're reading about it in the story, there is no reality. It is just the image. So how do you unpack that? How do you make sense out of that? What is really being talked about here? You don't know. Because all the certainties of art are removed. All of the concrete, objective reality of the world is gone. We're working without a net here, and it's kind of scary, but we have to make the best of it. If the image trembles, does the woman? If she sees the trembling, does that mean that she is not trembling, or is it just the mirror, or that she refuses to see it for one reason or the other? She cannot perceive that she herself is trembling. That is uncertain too. All of this is coming up. She was combing her hair at her leisure in front of the dressing table with its three mirrors. Three mirrors. You imagine one straight on, one just to the side, one to that, like a fairly standard vanity. But right there, three mirrors. Those are three perceptions, three different images, three different angles of viewing the same object. But is it the same object if you're viewing it different ways? These are more questions that are being circulated here, that are being just chummed into the water for us all to start snapping at. At leisure in front of the dressing table with its three mirrors. The dressing table is a place where she is putting on presumably makeup or cosmetics, or fixing her hair, or putting on a face, an all-consuming image that we have no real sense of reality beyond. We can't see her necessarily without that. Or maybe the thoughts that she is expressing are that reality. All of this is starting to collapse inside of itself, and it's like walking into a funhouse with all the mirrors all over the place, and you're never sure where you are. That is the confusion of the modern world. That is the confusion of the modernist world, the postmodernist world, where we are trying to come up with a way of interpreting reality. Her eyes did not look away as the mirrors trembled, sometimes dark, sometimes luminous. Again, I'm not certain whether or not the image in the mirror is trembling, meaning her, the reflected image, or the mirror itself, the physical presence of the mirror, the glass that reflects, is that trembling? I'm not certain. And for that matter, I'm also not certain what is sometimes dark, sometimes luminous. Luminous meaning light. Is it just the image that is sometimes dark, sometimes luminous? Is it the eyes that are sometimes dark, sometimes luminous? The slippery subject in that sentence makes it impossible to really decode. Now there we're dealing with grammatical terms. In translated material, you've always got to be conscious of that. But certainly I think they are leaning on this troubling relationship of perspective and objective reality, or the lack of any objective reality, and pointing out that, we might not know what is going on, but at least we have to know that we don't know what is going on. And we don't know what is going on because the line between reality and perception is so fluid, is so permeable. It at times doesn't even exist. That has intellectual repercussions, because if you reject the idea that all of those lines, all of those distinctions do not exist, you have to start to think about other distinctions, social distinctions, distinctions of rank, distinctions of race, distinctions of class, distinctions of gender. All of these distinctions become complicated, and you realize that it is nothing godly about it. There is nothing divinely designed about it. It is confusing. It is oppressive. It is empowering in certain respects, but you have to think of power as a finite source. And if you are taking power to create your own organization in the world, are you doing it at somebody else's expense? Or is somebody else doing it to you? All of these questions are being churned around, and there is no organized answer to how to deal with it. But through all these little suggestions, all these little hints that we're sifting through one after the other, trying to make some sense of it, we can start to put together a basic understanding of what this work of art means to each of us individually. Now, for me, I'll read through all of this, and a lot of it is sort of fun. A lot of it is downright, confusing. A lot of it is honestly very funny in many respects. But you look for the patterns. You look for what, why that? Why did you say that? Why is the character doing this? What does this really say? And when you step back like that, you can start to pluck out individual aspects of the text and organize them into something like meaning. Organize them into something like an idea that you can say, that's what this story is about. And maybe you're building a plot out of it so that it fits into a kind of a 3-act structure in your mind. Maybe you are empathizing with the character and highlighting the character into a kind of individual that you can not necessarily respect, but dignify with a kind of humanity that might not be so apparent from the first impression on the page, a drunk woman. But looking for those patterns, looking for those little tricks is not necessarily easy. What strikes me is the words and the images that this character tosses off out of her subconscious or whatever, what she herself notices, what she herself dwells upon, can't break free of. And you think in terms of, well, okay, drunk people are often circling back in what they're saying. And you can just dispel that as, well, there you repeating yourself, that's a sign you're not thinking clearly. Yeah, or it's a sign that, you're thinking at the same time you're talking, but they're not necessarily conjoined, because you're talking and you're producing all of these words, but your thought process and the things that are really concern you are operating on a deeper level. But every now and then they fracture through. And for me, one of the things that I find interesting in this, when they stumble upon the curious word pregnant. Naturally, she talked, and she lacked neither the ability to converse nor topics to discuss, but the words that the woman uttered when drunk were like being pregnant. Mere words on her lips which had nothing to do with the secret core that seemed like a pregnancy. Now, pregnant and pregnancy, those two words appear in the same sentence. As an editor, I would say, well, you sound repetitious there. Can we find something else? So the explicit use of those two words, those two very similar words, suggests to me that they are trying to be conspicuous. And then the very fact that the sentence itself is about words and about language. So you can see the writer behind here saying, pay attention to this. This is where I'm getting at something. I am writing about words, and I am tossing out words, not by accident, but deliberate words. And then throughout, I'm finding other references that are sort of similar, just a little bit down from there. And so, even more drunk, she peered round the room, and how she despised the barren people in that restaurant. Barren, coming so soon after the invocation of the word pregnant. Interesting. Right after that, not a real man among them. How sad it really all seemed, how she despised the barren people in that restaurant. Repetition, the barren people in her. Okay, she's hammering that home. She wants to make an impression with that word, with that concept, that turn of phrase, while she was plump and heavy and generous to the full. So you get the sense of she's a full-figured gal, perhaps. You can't idiosyncrasize it to her character exclusively. You can't just say that, well, she's a full-figured gal, and so she is thinking in different terms. So she's really not a person. She's more of a symbol. She's a representation. So once you understand that, you start thinking, well, okay, she's a representation of what? Of fullness? There are repeated references to bloatedness throughout this story, to her feeling bloated, overstuffed. And that takes particular shape when she starts focusing on another woman in that same restaurant, and how she resents her, and how she is very thin and glamorous looking, and all of that. And obviously there are some undertones here between what fat people and thin people have advantages in society, perhaps. But there is also a kind of representation of sexuality here. There is a physicality to this drunk woman who inhabits that bloated figure very fully. That is, from time immemorial, a sign of fertility, which can lead into sexual desirability, let's say. But mainly, I think you focus on the idea that if this woman is a representation, and if that room around her is a representation. If that room around her is barren, then the society around her is barren, and she, by contrast, is somewhat full. And if she is full, then maybe women are full, or that kind of woman is full, as opposed to everybody who's barren around her. And there you can go into biographical details, and you look up the biography and you realize that Clarice was writing this throughout the 1950s. She published it in like 1960 after her divorce, after she had lived 15 years as the life of a diplomat, going to polite cocktail parties and tea parties and living in a very simple suburban bourgeois culture in Chevy Chase, Maryland, primarily, stultifying suburban life, and she is perhaps reacting against that. But she is setting up these contrasts and making them conspicuous. You can't necessarily say that, well, okay, she's celebrating the drunk woman as a hero for pushing back against this stultifyingly barren society around her. You can't really say that because we're not given her as a point of great valoration. There is no sense that she is particularly admirable. She says some things throughout here that are actually pretty horrific, but even so, we can't help but admire a bit of the contrast and think about that contrast, because she is so vivid. Admirable or not, she is vivid and stands in stark contrast to that world around her. That world that we're only allowed access to through her perspective, and so we're automatically a little standoffish about, and we're not certain how to take it. But we are appreciating those fault lines between realities, those fault lines of perception, and we're aware that, well, maybe we are being a little too judgmental when we are told that, oh, the drunk woman, the daydreams of a drunk woman. Maybe there is something to be a little bit more concerned with there. Look at that line, not a real man among them. There is a repeated refrain throughout this about sexuality, quite frankly, virility, quite frankly. Her husband seems like an object of some derision to her, and not necessarily somebody that we are called on to respect an awful lot either, I would say. And she has that weird little dinner out with the wealthy friend where she is somewhat imagining a bit of a love triangle, and she's imagining the wealthy friend flirting with her, maybe even playing a little footsie under the table with her. But that's not even certain that she's perceiving that right. She is, after all, a drunk woman. So does any of that make sense? But that repeated refrain of the imperfect man, the perhaps barren man, the infertile man, the impotent man, the frustration with it. And again, we're led back to that first sentence with the trolley cars that pass her by in that room. So if there are trolley cars, perhaps there are two. One is the wealthy man, one is the husband. They are both men with penises, so they could be trolley cars, as Freud would have it, and they pass her by. She is not even a factor in it. She is no longer desirable, at least not like that thin woman in the elegant hat sitting over there, whom she so despises despite not knowing at all. But all of this is just pointing out the value of perception. All of this is just pointing out that unknowability of so much of life. We are swept into this presentation of stream of consciousness. Again, it's not first person, it is third person with a close identification. It is free indirect discourse where you hop back in and out of one character's mind. Sometimes you can see them objectively, sometimes you're seeing things right through their eyes. Here we're seeing 99% of this right through this character's eyes. And by doing so, you are calling into question those perceptions, those perspectives, and the very disciplined organization of those lines. And realizing how artificial and permeable they really are. There is nothing that organized in this world. This focus on perspective forces the limited nature of perspective itself into focus. The purpose of postmodern art, the purpose of high modernist art even, and that leads off into postmodernism, is about form more than content. The story itself, if there is one here, is almost irrelevant. They are just the daydreams of a drunk woman. But by attending to the way in which they are formed, we exercise our abilities to perceive patterns, to find order within chaos. And if we can do that, then maybe, if we can find order within the chaos of these few pages, maybe we can find order within the chaos of the world around us. Lispector is writing in the wake of the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the crack up of empires around the world. The Cold War has settled in. The world is a kind of chaos, and she is in her way, in this very personal, intimate, excruciatingly intimate way, pointing out how absurd so much of that is. And some of it is funny, and you're meant to laugh at it. That is a hallmark of postmodernism generally, laughing at the absurdity of the rules and striving for objectivity around us. But also to appreciate, I think, the profound suffering encountered by living through a life without those hierarchies, without those structures, without that sense of an organized, divine, possibly divine force structuring the universe in a coherent and meaningful way. There is mourning happening here. There is sadness that we all have to live like this. Even if there is a stubborn insistence that we do have to live like this, and to take shelter otherwise would be cowardice. So the drunk woman ultimately does become a bit of a hero. She rejects the assumptions around her. She rejects the judgment and the limitations of society. Maybe that is heroic in its way. Well, that's up to you. And that's the character, that is the primary character, that is the protagonist in every modernist and postmodernist work of art. The viewer, the reader, you, trying to find order within the chaos.